Okay, so Preston Lee, CTO at SkyCap. Do you have a brief introduction about who you are?
Yeah, yeah, hi, and nice to meet you again. Again,
Okay,
apologies
well,
for,
go ahead, go
oh, go
ahead.
ahead. Yeah, apologies for not being there today. I work a lot with HL7 Implementation Division. This presentation is not about that. It's about a grant that I work on part-time out at Arizona State University. This particular grant is dealing specifically with FHIR consent management and how to how to kind of reconcile the views of patients and providers um, that have substance use disorder and other types of protected records, and finding ways to facilitate better exchange of that information that both respect privacy and that are compliant. Reen, is there anything else that you wanted to introduce?
No. This is fine, go ahead.
Okay, all right, thank you. For the sake of time, I'm really going to fly through the slides, and then there's a brief demo that I'm also going to use doing Foundry 4 if you would like to play along at home, or you're particularly interested in the nature of the consent resource and how to use that going forward in the future. This is not a topic that I knew a lot about prior to last year. And so when you start kind of researching the nature of patient consent documents, one of the first things you get referred to in the US is Title 42, or excuse me, 42 CFR Part 2, which is decades old, I think maybe going back to the 70s, and was recently revised via final rule published a few months ago. I'm not attorney. We have those types on our advisory board. Part 2 makes a lot of revisions to protect the privacy of individuals seeking treatment for substance use disorders, or SUD, or just SUD for short, while allowing for necessary sharing of information for treatment, payment, healthcare operations, and so on. Further, it's intended to streamline the sharing of information by allowing patients to provide kind of a single consent or more consent documents for current and future use. And so the consent resource with the capital C is particularly relevant for these sorts of use cases. And then the final rule also further aligns 42 Part 2 with HIPAA, and then puts teeth around it for non-compliance. So there are some significant dates in 2026 that we'd be wise to pay attention to. The aim of this grant, most relevant to DevDays and FHIR, is really trying to demonstrate how to use FHIR for these very complicated types of use cases that are being prompted by the final rule. There is a implementation guide called Data Segmentation for Privacy, or DS4P, that is a really good primer on the use of security labels for annotating, applying metadata at the resource level to note, what types of protections apply to specific resources. So we're going down that path, as well as being tasked to evaluate the accuracy from a clinical standpoint of the way that we're applying such security labels, and to assess the potential impact that it's going to have, not just in 2026, but beyond in the US and worldwide. Within the technical objectives relevant to FHIR, I am a firm believer that the architecture for doing any sort of security labeling like this has to be very modular. And it's because there are a lot of different use cases where you may not have access to the complete picture, or that you may need to apply the same capabilities from the perspectives of different stakeholders. So we're trying to create a community-driven library at the center of this ecosystem, particularly for security labeling and content redaction, that we can use both on the server side and the client side, which is somewhat difficult. For this purpose, we've done it in TypeScript and are not using any of the Node APIs, so that you can use it in a front-end smart application without having to make a server-side call to do things like security labeling. One of the more frequently asked questions I get asked is, why aren't you using R4? That seems kind of peculiar. And there's a few reasons for that. One is the version of consent that comes with R4 was unfortunately kind of pretty immature at the time, and the version of R5 in R5 is very different. But more importantly, kind of regardless of what happens with US CDI in the next couple of years, what our real target is R6, as this program runs through 2028. And so we're trying to really skate to where the puck is going to be, as opposed to where it is right now, and then having to redo everything in a couple of years, just because the consent has changed so much since R4 is published. And then all of the work that we're doing in this area, we're going to be publishing through HL7 Foundry, and is actually one of the first use cases that I'm going to use for my Foundry-related work to demonstrate how to wire up complex assemblages of different FHIR-based capabilities into these higher order solutions that are really not just simple IGs anymore. There's two primary architectures that we're targeting to support. The first architecture is based on CDS hooks, which is heavily inspired by a former program called the ONC LEAP project, where essentially you're taking in this model, you're taking a security labeling and redaction service, as well as additional capabilities related to consent management, wrapping them in CDS hooks, and then on top of that, putting different sorts of UI applications. So on the kind of the right side here, we have a CDS hook service that we've provided in TypeScript on the backend side with a hook that is not standard, and I don't believe even is a proposed hook. It's really just a way for us currently to invoke via CDS hooks by providing a FHIR bundle and then asking this black box to apply security labels based on a number of information categories and rules, and then optionally redact information that is labeled in one or more ways. The second type of architecture that we're targeting is, I believe, much more practical and pertinent, which is the direct exchange, without using any sort of CDS capabilities, between two EHR systems, where you have a sender, you have a receiver, you have a patient in the mix as well that is electing certain preferences and providing electronic signature onto that document. The provider has needs to manage that, to understand, execute, apply, honor. It may need to apply additional consent documents for purposes of compliance or state level regulations that the patient isn't really need to be aware of. And then on the receiving side, they also have needs in security labeling and redaction, because they need the data that they're receiving, but also need to understand any obligations that they have in restricting access at the receiving institution. So just because you received data doesn't mean that you can do with it, what you will willy-nilly. There may be a lot of tags that are still applied to it and that are subject to constraints of a corresponding consent document that also came across the wire. So a couple of the challenges that I hope that you can take away from this presentation is couple questions. One, hypothetically, if I show you a medication statement, say for oxycodone, and I ask you, is this SUD data? Is this subject to 42 protections? And the answer is, I have no idea. It depends, not only on the clinical context, but under the final rule, it also depends on the provenance of the data. Like, what was the practitioner's role, the practitioner role, and what was the funding status of the department that they're operating in at the time that the order was placed? I mean, there are some very nuanced and difficult requirements to meet part two that we're not really prepared to address right now. Another example, if the patient says, I consent to my SUD data being shared, or maybe I want all of my mental health data, all of my behavioral and substance use information, go ahead and share that. Except when the receiving system gets it, I don't want Dr. Lee to be able to access it. So do whatever you need to, except this one person, or except this one department. Those exceptions are particularly hard to deal with, even though they're referenced in the consent resource use cases, because from the perspective of the sending system, I don't know what those IDs are. What is the identifier of that organization? What is the identifier of these practitioner rules? So we can notionally represent these concepts in a kind of a simple naive use case, but do we need to use a national directory? Does the sender need to query the receiving system to figure out all these IDs? does the sending system even allow the creation of unresolvable references? They're referring to an external FHIR resource. So there's a lot of potential problems. For the sake of time, I'm just going to fly directly into a demo here. I'm going to use Foundry to do this. And this is going to demo the architecture C slide right here, where we have an underlying Postgres system. We have instance of FHIR that's been configured to run in FHIR5 mode. We have our CDS hook service. We have 3 UI applications. And then not pictured here is we have a kind of a controller. I call it a stack controller on the top of it as well. To use this, I'm going to go ahead and actually just register a new environment. Right here, I'm just going to call this shares example. Save this. I'm going to fly over to the catalog, search for shares. Click that. We've provided a single default configuration. We'll be adding more in the future. For this demo, I'm just going to select my new shares namespace, hit that button, give it a second to automatically figure out how to wire Happy in to the shares stack. Now that's done, I'm going to go to this My Environments tab at the top, where I can inspect the way that each of these things, particularly FHIR, is configured under the covers. And then I'm going to click this Docker stack button because I just want to run this locally in my computer, which downloaded a single compose file. Now, I just happen to be using Docker. You can also use Podman if you'd like. I'm going to bring this stack up right here. So it's going to download all those individual services with the configuration that I've specified. While that's spinning up, because it's going to take a minute, I'm going to go back to the catalog here, go back to shares, and you'll see an instructions tab at the bottom. So in the future, when you go through this process with other IGs, we're going to start requiring some instructions on what to actually do once you spin up the examples. And then you'll also see this bundled products tab here, which will start to be enabled in Foundry for these more complex situations where you have to bundle in a number of different things. If you search for the Shares Patient Consent Portal, the Provider Portal, the Rules Studio, the Security Labeling Service, you won't find them in Foundry because they're not visible, but they are there, which is how they're able to be wired up. All right, so now it looks like everything has spun up, hopefully. And now if I go to Instructions tab, it says you can start with the stack controller here. Now, since I've downloaded images that are generic to everybody, including a generic FHIR server that has no knowledge of data, the controller can be used here to load selected files. So I'm going to load in my organization or practitioner and a bunch of synthetic patients. So that's going to apply those from a web interface. Give it a sec here to finish up. Looks like that's done. All right, now I can start clicking through in my architectural diagram all of these components. So I'm going to start by looking at my CDS hook service. And for shares, if I go to CDS hook services, you'll see our non-standard patient consent consult hook meant to be compatible with the ONC Elite project right here, but that's not very visual, so it's not interesting. Now, in designing a modular system, we felt that it was very important to provide user interfaces so that you don't have to be a developer, to edit a 10,000 line configuration file for the CDS hook service. And similarly, when you show these concepts, to providers and to patients, they don't want to look at all the technical junk that we do. So there's these 3 UI applications. This should be provider portal, that's a typo. The rules manager here. What this is doing is it's downloading the configuration file from the CDS hook service with currently a very naive, really just terminology-based value set expansion of the various codes that will constitute various types of security labels. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but providing a UI here in case someone wants to edit it, to import new code sets under different information sensitivity categories, remove dupes, and so on. Moving along, we have our provider portal and a patient portal. If I look at the provider portal here, which has already been wired up to Happy on the backend side, the idea with this proof of concept is to provide a largely complete-ish R5, R6 consent builder. It is in progress, but I think we have a decent start at it. So if you want to build a new consent from a provider standpoint, I'm going to go ahead and select Alan Adrian here.
Preston, you have 5 minutes, including Q&A. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, excellent. Thank you. I'm going to add a couple organization references to that. And this is one of those question prompts that I mentioned before. I don't know how to represent organizations at the on the receiving side here. Without going into details on what consents can do, this particular consent is going to permit access to Alan's data, except as declared in the provisions element of the resource. And then you can nest these provisions that logically invert at every nest, which is, it's a clever design, but it's kind of intuitive, can be kind of unintuitive from a user perspective to represent the recursion and logical inversion and so on. All right. And then of course, within our provider portal, you can view the consent resource that's being created here. One of the aspects of this research project is to try to distill down types of information into these 11 information sensitivity categories. This is not part of FHIR. However, patients and providers do tend to highly prefer these sorts of like pre-coordinated types of classifications, since they can't be expected to go into great detail on what is and isn't permissible to exchange, at like the level of thousands of things. All right. From a patient perspective, we will also be assessing patient preferences, and this is just a basic proof of concept. Now, if we look at Alan Adrian's consent, what we'll be doing is providing those same information sensitivity categories and allowing or showing this system or screenshots to patient advocacy folks to get their perspectives on whether or not it's useful to represent a consent this way. And then further, what we're doing, similarly to the consent to shares project that is pretty dated now, we're building in the FHIR-based security labeling and redaction services into this experience. And so if they're curious, like, well, what records do I have that would be subject to these exchange rules, they can simply click through and then see, well, there is an alphenyl hydrochloride element of some sort that occurs in my medical record, and they can make their own decision whether they want to exchange or not exchange that data. And we're working on some debugging utilities as well to try to in layman's terms express the logic that went into defining or the classification of why this particular record is being labeled in the way it is. And that sort of like transparency, it's not AI, but that sort of transparency mechanism is important, but very difficult, especially given the complexities of 42 CF4 Part 2. All right, so to kind of put a bow on it, back in the slides here, if you are interested in getting involved in the community core library, we'd love to have your participation. I've got a couple students as well that are working on this. You can, wrong slide. Just go to asushares.com. There's a newsletter link. You can contact me directly as well. And of course, we have our GitHub links and everything else. So if we have a few minutes for questions.
There's not a lot of time for questions, but let's take one. And Preston, do you have access to the Whova app?
I do.
Yeah, so the audience, you can also answer any questions in the Whova app. And if you can monitor the Whova app for the upcoming day or so, Preston, there may be some questions coming up. Anyone? Okay.
Thanks. Super interesting. The consent, you mentioned you went to R5 instead of R4. Can you say a little bit about what was missing from R4? And do you know if there's a backport of the R5 stuff to R4?
Ooh, so the latter portion of that, I'm really doubting it. R4 was, and forgive me if I'm butchering this, but our initial assessment of prior work is that our R4 was primarily assuming that the patient is the subject, and that it put some like cardinality constraints and didn't have a lot of the current, it didn't break down some of the more administrative and controlling fields in enough granularity to be particularly useful. And so R5, if you do the diff on the website, you'll see a lot of new stuff that shows up between like who's managing the consent, who's enforcing it. The way that the logical provisions work is also a bit different. So I'm really doubting that someone would backport R5 to R4. I think that would be pretty difficult.
Thank you. Final question, anyone? No? Okay, thank you very much. Then we'll wrap it up. And if you have a question, there's the Q&A tab in this session, and Preston will monitor the Q&A. Thank you very much. Preston, thanks. Take care.